Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 11 of Series 11, and the question for today is: can value ethics supersede all others as well as express human values? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 8. Last week we discussed how the strengths and weaknesses of virtue theory led to adopting a value theory ethics. We previously also discussed how all the main theories of ethics were too deeply flawed to be acceptable. This has led to the idea of value theory ethics superseding all these theories of ethics, as well as eventually leading to a more general value theory as a philosophy of life. Today we can discuss the potential of value theory ethics in greater detail. Yet the amount of material needed to cover this question means that this workshop will take the form of a summary, review and a preview. And I should repeat that value theory ethics introduces value and values central to my philosophy of life. That is, an affirmation of or will to value can lead to a certain quality and sufficiency of value, and that such value also resolves problems in activities like meaning, purpose, ethics and morals. The significance of value is seen in that, to begin with, all ethical principles are values that guide moral action, and that in religion God is the believer's highest value and various dogmas express particular values. Politics has been described by David Easton as the authoritative allocation of values. A meaningful life is also valuable, worthwhile and lit up by value. And some degree of value can be found in every aspect of human life. But a value theory ethics, and even more so, a value philosophy of life, needs more than this ubiquity of value. Cognition and volition, for example, can also claim ubiquity without being able to frame principles of ethics. That is, a value theory or any theory of ethics need to be able to resolve a number of issues. Some of these we have discussed, some of these we discuss here, and others we will discuss later. We have recently discussed, for example, the adequacy, or rather the inadequacy, of other competing theories of ethics. We have also outlined a definition of ethics and morality as reflecting value back onto the agent. And in previous series, I have shown the neglect of value as a concept and as a principle of ethics. But some issues are more difficult to resolve, so I tackle them in the following studies. These are such as establishing a value imperative on phenomenological, empirical, pragmatic and rational grounds, how to derive material guidance for action from a formal principle of value, and the particular problem of relations with and ethical treatment of other people. Yet there are issues that we could consider now as well as develop later. These include a review of value theory ethics, challenges from Hume's and More's critiques, answered with ethics providing its own foundation and an ability to engage the moral will. To begin with, we have already started to define value theory ethics as a development of virtue theory ethics, and that the central principles of other theories of ethics are also values that define their theories. For instance, the principles of eudaimonia and excellence of character are the values of virtue theory. The principle of utility, to maximize happiness, is the central value of utilitarianism, and the principles of reason and goodwill are values for Kantian ethics. So for Kantian ethics and utilitarianism, goodwill and happiness are their objectives and their values respectively. But on a value theory ethics, the objective itself is value, that we also value as a principle of ethics. Hence, on a value theory ethics, we value value as a will to value and as a pursuit of value. Robert Nozick has spoken about the value of values. I'm talking about the value of value. And this provides a sought after definition of ethics as well as a philosophy of life. But you will not understand value theory ethics if you regard values as external properties of objects rather than mental states that I have coined as value states that can be both experienced and pursued. To introduce this idea, I interpreted the virtues and dispositions of virtue theory as value states of value theory ethics. Examples of value states are love, dignity, self-esteem, moral fortitude, and magnanimity. But value states can be both positive and negative values that are omitted here. So on this account, I define the moral good with the concept of value thought to be undefinable by G.E. Moore. And ethics is also sometimes mistakenly described as only consisting of relations with other people. That is, ethics needs to explain relations with other people, but ethics has a broader compass than that. And on value theory ethics, morality can be defined as the process of reflecting moral values back onto the agent. And that reflection of value back onto the agent accounts for the elevating experience of morality. That is, actions deemed to be moral reflect positive judgments and values back onto the agent. Conversely, actions deemed to be immoral reflect negative judgments. Moreover, actions deemed moral or immoral carry special value for the agent because they have been attributed with a special value of moral events. Yet the moral content of those actions in the above definition is deliberately unspecific. This is because what is deemed to be moral action in this account isn't fixed or definitive. This is partly explained by the fallibilist character of value theory ethics, explained shortly. Yet a constant principle here is the will to value underlying value theory ethics. This is a principle of action to be established later on phenomenological, empirical, pragmatic and rational grounds. A value-based theory of reasons makes some headway here towards establishing a value theory ethics, but it lacks an underlying principle of value. Yet value theory ethics also offers internal reasons for actions that can also engage the will. And phenomenology provides grounds for action based on structures of consciousness and value. But phenomenology typically doesn't derive moral or motivating values from those structures. Sartre, for example, stated that phenomenological ontology cannot itself formulate ethical principles, unquote. But we will see later how Sartre's concept of choice and selection in the form of the structure of divisibility, and how Husserl and Heidegger's concept of temporality as a structure of consciousness work together to explain how value is a fundamental property of consciousness. Empirical grounds for value as an underlying principle are evident in drives for self-esteem, meaning and morals. Pragmatic grounds are found in the fact that value does what we need it to do in theory and practice. And rational grounds will be demonstrated in the contradictions of not valuing value. Yet for the moment, a principle of volition and value can be constructed on a more basic presupposition. That is, I value myself, and as a value-seeking agent, I seek to maintain and further my value. Therefore, I must ask, what must I do in order to maintain and further my value? As noted earlier, actions judged as virtuous will accrue value. Actions judged as bad will negate value. For example, taking things that don't belong to you and that you don't need is greed, which reflects negative value. There is also a more powerful motivation at work here. It is the above idea that moral action enhances our self-value that is a primary driving force, to be explained by both specific arguments and the combined weight of these presentations. But even if we can eventually establish a motivating principle, the problem of justification stands in our way in at least two ways. One is justifying the primacy of the principle of value theory ethics over other theories of ethics. Another is standard problems such as Hume's law that forbids deriving a moral ought from a factual is, G.E. Moore's naturalistic fallacy, and Mackey's rejection of objective values. These principles are part of the problem of justification that all theories of ethics must overcome. Aristotle seems to ignore the problem with an acceptance of virtue as excellence of character. Kant takes it that we are obliged to act on the dictates of reason that reveals our duty and the moral law. Mill holds that it is psychologically and metaphysically impossible not to desire the pleasant. William Frank Kenner thought that an ought can be derived from an is with God, who introduces moral obligations. Kurt Bayer just adopts a moral point of view to avoid Hume's rejection of factual and theoretical premises. But this strategy faces the problem of justifying why that moral point of view should be adopted. Yet another version of this view looks to the inescapability of value rather than that of the moral point of view. But as Philippa footnotes, this inescapability isn't the necessity of a Kantian categorical imperative, which unrealistically applies to all rational creatures in all circumstances. This is the inescapability of a value state that would eventually be reached in some degree given sufficient time, knowledge and awareness. Yet it's my view that a value theory ethics can resolve the problem of justification in three ways. One, by taking value as a precondition of the ethical process rather than having to infer value from facts. Two, by being able to produce a self-validating principle of value sought by Nietzsche, Williams and others. And three, by making a choice for a principle that is derived from value preferences rather than facts. The first method of taking value as a precondition begins the ethical process with a pre-existing value that thereby avoids deriving values from fact or theory. But that initial value can't just be used to justify subsequent moral values directly. This would incur the fallacy of the non-transferability of value that I argued for previously. But the alternative of an inescapable will to value, expressed in such forms of self-esteem or meaning, would include implementation of other values. For example, gratuitously harming others is pathological, which on this understanding reflects negative value onto the agent. Or such behaviour indicates an inferiority complex, which is also a form of low esteem or low value. Yet of course such values and thought processes presuppose an awareness of these things, which is why value theory ethics is fallibilist in determining the material content of action. But this example begins to explain the material content of value theory ethics that we will discuss in detail shortly at a later date. That is, judgments about material content of action in value theory ethics will be fallible because they depend on the agent's limited knowledge as well as a grasp of the proposed principle. Yet this compares favourably to Popper's fallibilist view of knowledge that it can be mistaken, as well as contrasting favourably with the apodictic certainty of Kant's categorical imperative. On a value theory ethic, we must work out what is the best thing to do pragmatically and contingently. And in this way, fallibilism in science or in ethics isn't a weakness, but a strength. There are limits to contingency, and we should note that theories of ethics need to demonstrate at least three things. 1. A foundation or basis. 2. A formal principle. And 3. Material outcomes of action in practice. 1. The foundation of value theory ethics is found in the structures of consciousness and value. 2. The formal principle of value theory ethics is the will to value or the affirmation of value. And 3. The material content or outcome is provided by the judgment of actions as good or bad. Yet there is a further fourth requirement also voiced by Bernard Williams. That is, an ethics must also account for human error and weakness. And value theory ethics is fallibilist and able to explain error, as well as it being inescapable for two reasons. 1. It's inescapable because the satisfaction of human motivation must inevitably be directed towards value. And 2. It's fallibilist in the manner of Popper's fallibilist theory of knowledge and falsification theory of science. That is, the material content of action is only directed by our best assessments of knowledge and reason. This approach replaces untenable ethical necessity with the more arguable inescapability. That is, as A.J. Ayer explained, strict necessity can only apply to logic, not physics or ethics. There can be no definitive criteria for determining the material content of right action in a complex and diverse world. This is because actions will differ in different circumstances by different people, even as expressions of a unifying principle such as the will to value. But it might be argued that action determined by the best thing to do is no better than social convention. Yet on a value theory ethic, acting on the best thing is guided by value theory, as given in these studies. But again, even given a guiding principle of value, other problems for value theory ethics need to be addressed, such as seeking to rationally maximize one's own value doesn't seem to be an adequately moral ideal. Put bluntly, it just seems to be selfish and not enlightened self-interest, as might be claimed. And as a subjectivist value theory ethic, it raises the difficult issue of respect for other people. Bernard Williams presents such subjectivist theories of ethics with the problem of self-indulgence. He writes, what the agent cares about is not so much other people as himself caring about other people, unquote. And virtue theorists similarly criticize Kantians as just attempting or willing to do good. This is because virtue theorists regard real moral good as internalized into character and disposition. I want to respond to this issue in three ways. These are: 1. By distinguishing reflective from non-reflective forms of value theory ethics. 2. By qualifying value theory objectives as certain qualities and sufficiencies of value states. And 3. As one of those objectives, an appreciation of the intrinsic value of other people. To begin with, value theory was said to involve an affirmation or will to value leading to a sufficiency of value. But that sufficiency isn't just a maximization or quantification, but a quality of value. And that quality must encompass features like ambivalence, absence, alterity, vulnerability, and need. And in answer to the question, why must it encompass such features? The answer is because, as earlier, we have chosen them as the best we can find. To illustrate such a choice, we can consider the question of other people that we will examine separately later. Nevertheless, Kant tells us that we must treat humanity as an end and never merely as a means. Yet for Kant, the value of others is derived from their rationality and the universalization of their own dignity and value as ends in themselves. But rationality and universalization are inadequate reasons to value other people. Robert Nozick advises that we should value another person as a value-seeking I. But this isn't a great advance over Kant's universalization and respect for rational beings as ends. This is because Nozick doesn't explain why we should value a person as a value-seeking I. We will answer this question later in a forthcoming study. Yet value theory ethics recognizes other people as conscious beings who have intrinsic value, and that our own value could depend upon the recognition of that value and by giving it due consideration. That is, ethical relations with others requires a theory of relations, not just a recognition of their value. So appreciation of others is part of the proposed sufficiency of value that isn't just a maximization but a quality. Moreover, human finitude means that sufficiencies are always insufficient and are works in progress. And this insufficiency, as well as sufficiency, is also driving value forward towards a further will to value. And the question of what does the will to value lead to? It is answered with a sufficiency of value. Yet it need not lead to anything. It could be its own reward as a value or as a tenable theory. But I hold that the will to value or the value of value results in a certain sufficiency of value. And this is expressed as value states like self-esteem, dignity, courage, and magnanimity. I have previously not only compared Aristotle's virtues with value states, but also his eudaimonia and supreme good that he qualifies with both self-sufficiency and finality. In modern thought, however, Aristotle's concept of finality cannot be attributed to values in that form. But the idea of sufficiency having finality reminds us that a sufficiency of value should indeed be sufficient and not tacitly appealing to some feature beyond itself. I'm making 2 points here. One is that value sufficiency is both an actual and hypothetically ideal objective in a theory of value. Another is about the internal sufficiency of value that can be expressed as a disposition to act. And that disposition is explained by distinguishing reflective from non-reflective forms of value theory ethics. Yet value theory ethics has been presented above as a rational and a reflexive process choosing value. But non-reflective forms of value theory ethics are also available. Virtue and existential ethics, for example, are typically non-reflexive. That is, they express dispositions and authenticity. Yet virtue theory and existentialist ethics can also accommodate determination of right action through reason. And value theory ethics can similarly choose action simply as a rational expression of the agent's values. That is, the agent can act on reflecting whether his actions reflect well or badly on himself. But like virtue theory, on value ethics, an agent can legitimately have internalized values that he seeks to express. On this view, he doesn't ask, how can I maximize my value, but how can I best express my values? Those values can be better or worse and are expressed in action and in relations with other people. Yet these values can be informed for the better by principles of value suggested later. Moreover, The agent's values can be internalized as aspects of his character and dispositions, as in virtue theory. The agent can thereby act pre-reflectively, as on virtue theory, avoiding recriminations of self-interest. Value theory ethics can thereby express its values in three ways. One, as a rational choice to maximize or develop one's own values, which may entail respect for others. Two, as an expression of the values I hold without an overt pursuit of self-interest or self-value. And three, as a pre-reflexive expression of internalized values from within my character and dispositions. In this case, the good person doesn't will good or try to be good. He is good, as in virtue theory, or as Yoda of Star Wars says, do not try, do. Yet I should now briefly outline the origin and development of the values underlying these three possibilities. This is because I promised earlier to establish a principle on phenomenological, empirical, pragmatic and rational grounds that we can choose on its self-evident advantages, as well as that a final justification can only be chosen based on our best judgments. And those judgments must take into account the strictures of Hume, More, Mackey and others, the failures of virtue theory, Kantian, utilitarian and all known other theories of ethics, and their foundations in religion, nature, reason, knowledge, genetics or even consciousness that prompt the idea that a theory of ethics should provide its own foundation, endorsed by Nietzsche, Williams, Dworkin and others. Yet the idea implied here of the will to value as a self-validating principle was argued in an earlier series. That is, self-validating principles are found in logic and mathematics, but not thought possible in physics or ethics. Self-validation can be established in logic or mathematics by non-contradiction. For example, logic is determined by the self-evident and self-validating truths of Aristotle's 4 basic principles of logic. David Hilbert described mathematics as avoidance of contradiction and is therefore a self-validating a priori. And a self-validating system within the human sphere is Descartes' I think, therefore I am. Physics isn't self-validating because it's an a posteriori system of contingent observations. Importantly, mathematics and logic are self-validating but can't establish principles for systems of physics or ethics. But I propose that the will to value is self-validating because, among other reasons, the alternative to not value value is contradictory and self-negating. The will to value can also be described as the value of value, the affirmation of value, or the pursuit of value. Firstly, the will to value as the value of value isn't a tautology. It isn't a tautology because value can affirm value or not as a system of value of which it is a part. But it must affirm or value the system of value of which it is a part in order to value anything. And in a comparable way to I think, therefore I am, value itself presupposes the will to value. And therefore not to value value is contradictory and self-negating. But I will give a more complete version of this argument next week. Yet not valuing value, which you may have chosen as the best option, can be self-contradictory in different ways. As above, not valuing value is a denial of the principle by which you are denying value. Not valuing value can also be a denial of an aspect of consciousness which we can't escape. And not valuing value can be a denial of a positive principle which is regressive. We are unexpectedly talking about constraints on choice derived from subjectivity. Hegel also paradoxically finds constraints arising from the exercise of freedom in his philosophy of right. Sartre follows Hegel but because consciousness, choice, value and freedom are mutually implicative. Sartre is then able to go on to insist that we are condemned to choose and are condemned to be free. The point for us is that denial of choice can thereby be interpreted as a negation of value, and the avoidance of value and choice as bad faith can be viewed as regressive or contradictory. Sartre's notion of the spirit of seriousness illustrates the contradiction of not valuing the subjectivity of value. The spirit of seriousness is to take subjective values as objective to avoid freedom and responsibility. Either principles or objects can be thought to have objective value rather than subjective value. The seriousness is to say that certain values are objective and therefore I have no choice. But if those values are subjective, this would be a contradictory position. So there are at least three arguments here in favour of the will to value as a principle of ethics and of life. 1. Justification, self-validation and internal coherence of value as a system of value call for a will to value. 2. To value physical or cognitive objects instead of value itself is ultimately regressive. And 3. To not value or affirm value itself is contradictory, self-negating and self-defeating. Therefore the will to value value is both valid and a self-validating principle. My position is that not valuing value as a will to value is contradictory, self-negating and self-defeating. Therefore the will to value value is a self-validating system. But that does not make it an adequate principle of ethics, which has to fulfill many other functions. These are functions like truth, human practicality and providing material content of action. One of these requirements is a resolution of the noted problem of the value posed by Hume, More and others. Value theory of ethics mitigates this problem by starting with the presence of value, not with facts or reason. This can be achieved with a structural or phenomenological account of the origins of value. And such an account of the origins of value also provides at least 2 or 3 requirements of value theory ethics. 1. It explains the basis on which the will to value can be established. 2. It makes the immediate point of establishing a foundation for a value theory of ethics. And 3. Such an account explains the significance of value as an aspect of consciousness and human life. In my view, a credible analysis and explanation of value is found in the phenomenology of consciousness. This is because phenomenology generally makes a close identification between consciousness and value. For example, Heidegger cites care as a being of Dasein, and Sartre writes that the being of the self is value. And he continues that reflective consciousness cannot arise at the same time without disclosing values, unquote. What we are saying here is that value and consciousness are coexistent. This is explained with Sartre's close identification between consciousness, value, choice and selection. He writes that choice and consciousness are one and the same thing, and that every choice supposes elimination and selection, thereby producing value. And Sartre writes that choice isn't just preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. But Sartre doesn't actually provide an analysis tracing choice back to its ontological foundation. But we can fill in by saying that contrast is a form of selection essential to cognition and thereby to consciousness. And we can continue that contrast and selection are expressions of choice that produce value. For example, when I look left or right, I affirm what is on my right and negate what is on my left. These are kind of selections that are central to epistemic contrasts and perceptions. For example, a white spot on a white board can't be seen. It needs a contrast. but at least 4 objections can be made to this kind of explanation of values. 1. It is only an explanation of incipient values. 2. Values emerge from social or biological sources without selection or choice. 3. These incipient values are not the values we need for motivation, morality, meaning or purpose. And 4. More widely, value theory ethics doesn't provide a social ethics or a political philosophy. I have several answers to this last criticism. Firstly, different theories focus on different aspects of ethics, like fundamental principles or social ethics. Secondly, value theory ethics avers from giving rules for every action in every circumstance. And thirdly, value theory ethics provides the principles from which judgments for action can be made. I will give an account of the practical applications of value theory ethics in a forthcoming study. In response to social or biological values, such must be experienced in consciousness in order to be values. That is, an automatic propensity to action is not a value. Such are only latent or potential values, if values at all. They only become values as mental states and moral values on selection when chosen as preferences. On this view, animals are conscious creatures who can have values but not moral values. Also, incipient values inherent to consciousness do not provide us with prescriptive moral values. But unlike social or naturalistic accounts, the above account is able to develop one with the faculty of choice. Also, in response to the criticism of explaining only trivial values, we can take the phenomenological analysis further. Martin Heidegger emphasized temporality and time as the horizon of being. Edmund Husserl spoke of the flow of consciousness and the flow of becoming, in which every experience has necessarily been preceded in time by experiences. We find ourselves in a world of time or temporality, as well as diversity, divisibility, selection and choice. The diversity of the world demands selections and choices that produce value. Yet consciousness is also moving through time as well as through the diversity of space. Judgments and values must be continually produced to cope with the flow of existence. This is both an underlying presence and confrontation of value and values that can be either ignored or acted out. Value and values constitutes the very material with which we must choose and make choices about. I look to my left and see a window. I look to my right and see a door. I choose to walk to the door. Outside I find someone lying on the floor. What do? Help, walk past, or ignore the person? Now I need recourse to the value theory ethics and affirmation of value that I have outlined above. In conclusion, my argument for value theory ethics take both positive and negative forms. Negative arguments include the failure of standard ethical theories that have been made elsewhere. These arguments, together with the inadequacies of cognitive, affective and volitional theories, direct us towards values, value states and a value theory ethics. That is, a value theory ethics is constructed on the principle of a will to value value and the pursuit of value. And the will to value produces a certain sufficiency of value in value states like self-esteem and magnanimity. Yet this will to value isn't simply self-value or a maximization of value, but a quality of value. And that sufficiency and quality of value provide an ethic in the form of a value theory ethics. The advantages of a value theory ethic over others is that it engages the moral will and avoids the is-ought problem. And it does this not by demanding a categorical imperative and complete uniformity of moral action, but through the eventual inescapability of a principle of value that allows various expressions as well as explaining the moral experience as value deflected back onto the agent. Such a historical development of morality and ethical theory is entirely expected, yet has always been resisted. Development is evident from Judaic ethics of law to Christian and Kantian ethics of intention. Development continues to modern and postmodern views of circumstances and individuality. And I see value theory ethics as part of this development. But I have grave doubts about whether ethics and morals is an adequate means of describing human experience. That is, not just as a limitation of not being able to describe the whole of human experience, but not being able to properly describe that area of value experience usually assigned to ethics. For these reasons, I submit the will to value and sufficiency of value, not as principles for alternative ethics, but as points of departure for another way of understanding human existence as consciousness. Let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom and meetup.com. I would like to know if you think I have made a contribution to ethical thought or whether I have made serious mistakes that I should be informed about.